it's MK. Welcome back to this next session of videos for Sim Series. So today we're going to continue our discussion and some examples on pantographs, specifically related to start points and advancing. I get a lot of questions online and I see a lot of chatter on some of the social media groups about people that are just not sure about getting repositioned and getting realigned and advancing the quilt and making sure that you can do that easily row to row. I have some really easy techniques that I've been using for a while, and they're really simple. So I'm going to take you inside of simulation and then I'll meet you right back here.
All right, so here we are, and we're going to pick up from where we left off. But first, I just want to mention what I have on the screen. The first thing I have open is just a line drawing to represent a quilt that we would have loaded. So these outer lines, those are the quilt. And so the quilt is basically just a quilt with two borders on it. These long horizontal lines are meant to represent what my throat depth might be. These lines are 18 inches apart. So because I don't have rails to use as a reference when I'm doing these videos, I just put these lines in there so that we can talk about advancing and start points. This is the pantograph that I created in the other video, so we're just going to work with the same one. And remember, this technique is very good for pantographs where you plan to stitch them completely off the edge of your quilt and just crop them off on the sides. Again, this one does not have any wrapping or cropping along the top edge. All of those details are covered in one of my online classes that you can check out if you would like. Just go to www.mkquilts.com. So let's get started. If we were going to use this pattern on this quilt, we would have our quilt loaded and we're ready to begin. So we would pull our machine into position and we would come up here a little bit off to the left-hand side and do an area. We would pull our machine towards our rails and over to the right-hand side. So I'm only going as far as that vertical line, and I would put another two corner. Now remember from the other video, what we would do is regardless of how high this area box is, we want to make it taller than the pattern that we created. So I'm going to go ahead and make this box 40. All right, next thing that I normally do with the pattern selected and open is I just align it. And I align it to the center and to the top. And one of the reasons why I align it to the center is so that we can adjust it to help us with start points. So let's go ahead and do a crop, outside closed, and let's see what happens to our start points. In this particular case, I am very happy because my start point is at the top. If at all possible when I work with pantographs, I try to make sure that my start point is at the top. When I build my master pantograph, I will build it like that. But when we actually take it to our quilt and crop, our start points are probably going to be altered because we've cropped the pattern. So just a little side note, if you do cropping and your start points are not at the top, just take a minute and go over here under Reposition. Come down to your nudge number. Make that a small number, like maybe 1/10 of an inch. So I'm just going to make that 0.1. And I'm going to start using either my right or my left arrow, doesn't matter. And I'm just going to start clicking that one click at a time and watching what happens to my start points. Most often, you're going to be able to adjust that start point back to the top of the pattern just by adjusting the position. And if you think about what we did, we created a very wide pantograph, and then we centered it in our area box. So we have plenty of wiggle room to go back and forth one way or the other until we get our start points where we want them. You'll notice I stopped here for a second just to show you that as I clicked that left arrow, my start point on this set of patterns now, or these passes of this pattern, are now at the bottom. I think it's easier to advance if we have our start point at the top. So let's continue to click until we get our start point back towards the top of our pattern. And this might take a couple of clicks, so just hold with me. Okay, and it doesn't have to be perfectly exactly at the top. That one looks pretty good to me. So I'm going to baseline. All right, so at this point I would save this. I'm going to do a save. And I'm just going to call it the name of whoever my customer is. So I'm just going to call this MK Quilt. All right, I'm going to clear my area, and let's just talk about this before we stitch. And I'm just going to click, hold, and drag and move my crosshairs out of the way. So using our lines as a guide, you can see that I'm going to be able to stitch 1, 2. 2 passes of this pattern is all I'm going to be able to stitch, but I am going to be able to get myself to my 3rd start point before I advance. I'm not going to be able to stitch this row, but I am going to be able to get myself to the start point because it's on the top. So that's an important reason why I try to adjust those start points to the top. Sometimes that's not possible, and we can deal with that in another video. But if at all possible, try to get them to the top. So I would go ahead and let this stitch out, have a pull-up on. I don't do tie-offs in the batting, and we'll just let it stitch. All right, I'm just going to take a minute and fast forward. We don't need to sit here and watch this stitch. And I'm going to talk you through how I get to my next start point and advance when this is done stitching at the end of the 2nd row. All right, so here we are. It's finishing up stitching the end of the 2nd row. My machine's going to stop. And I am going to double check before I let my machine travel to that next start point that I can truly clear my rail. Now, we already checked that when we started, but if there's any hesitation on your part about whether or not you can clear your rail, just grab your machine, pull it down towards your rail, and as long as your horizontal orange line is below that 3rd start point, you're going to be all right. So I just resume, and I let Pro Stitcher travel to the next start point, not because I'm going to stitch, but because I'm going to let my needle go down and up, and I'm going to put a mark in my quilt right there so that I can put a pin or a marker mark right in my batting and advance. Okay, I'm going to stop the video here. I'm going to do a little advancing of my quilt and talk you through repositioning. All right, so here we are back. I have closed those vertical rows just because I think you get the idea now. I have also closed the pattern that would have stitched up here. Okay, so I advanced my quilt, and you can just use your imagination that those rows that we did before are stitched down on this quilt. Okay, we talked about having a marker mark or some sort of a positioning mark, maybe a pin in the batting right here. Now, I stopped this pattern in this session to show you this, and this is a very important step. What I'm going to do now is I'm always going to reposition myself based on this first start point, and I'm just going to continue to stitch the first 2 rows of this pattern and use my 3rd row as my positioning row. But right now, my start point is over here, because that's where I stopped to advance this video. So whatever happens with your quilting, maybe you had a bobbin change right in here, or maybe you had a thread break right here, so you had to establish a new start point to get yourself started again. When you advance your quilt and put your machine into position over the marker mark, you want to make sure to jump your start circle back to the very beginning so that we're always working with row 1. So let's go to Quilt, New Start Point, and jump that back all the way to the first start point. Now we're ready to reposition this pattern right on top of where we put the mark. We're going to go into Design, Reposition, and we're going to reposition and snap it right on the start point. Now we're ready to stitch again. And we basically know, because of the way that we set up this pattern and because of our throat depth, that we're only going to need 3 rows. If you wanted to, you could cut off these bottom rows. I generally just leave the number of rows open. Whatever it is what it is. And when I get down to the bottom of the quilt, I'm just going to define a new area down here. I'm going to reposition just like I did just now. Wherever that mark was on my quilt, I'll just reposition my pattern inside of there, and then I'll crop off whatever I don't need at the bottom of the quilt. All right, so that's a very, very simple way that I've been doing pantographs for a long, long time. I just use my start point to reposition, let my machine travel over at the end of whatever row is the last row that I can get to, let it travel over to the next start point, put a marker or a pin right there in my batting, advance my quilt, and always reposition myself back to the first full row. All right, everyone, that's it for now. Until next time, it's MK.
All right, so I hope you can see how that was just an expansion of the video that I did prior. Just set up those pantographs longer than you would ever be able to use them, crop them off on the sides, pay a little bit attention to your start points, and just use those first 2 or 3 or maybe 3 or 4 rows just to stitch over and over again, always repositioning yourself on the first row. I hope this has been helpful, and until next time, everybody, from my studio to yours, happy quilting. Bye-bye.